So I moved to New York City when I was 22 years old, which was a big leap from my upbringing in Seaman, Ohio, which has a population of 800. From the beginning, my boyfriend and then husband, Bill, and I have been perpetual tourists here. When the pandemic hit, we took to the streets. Our dog, Frankie, became our excuse to walk miles every day, each excursion uncovering something we hadn't seen before. In his new book, The Intimate City, Walking New York, I have a copy right here, Michael Kimmelman travels this same territory, but with the companionship of architects, historians, writers, and friends. These are walking tours that help you see what's in front of your eyes, but also what was there before and what might be there in years to come. Michael is a brilliant critic, reporter, and thinker. He's also empathetic, endlessly curious, and always interesting. Plus, he's a fabulous musician, once a child prodigy. Michael, welcome to At Lunch.
Hey, Julie, sorry, there I am. Sorry.
I know, I was having a little trouble with that too.
Yeah, just having a little glitch with the video. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Nice to see you too. I like your new
yes, the COVID beard.
Very nice.
I know. We'll see
Very
how
nice.
long it lasts.
So, Michael, The Intimate City, which I am a huge fan of, reflects the way you've approached being a critic. You're an expert, but you're also a reporter. You're an aesthetic arbiter, but also an appreciator. But the story for me of this book is also a story about the pandemic and how you survived it in a way. Could you just tell us a bit about how the project got started and what it meant to you as a critic and personally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is really born of the pandemic because, you know, in the simplest sense, like everybody else, I was at once panicked and also, you know, faced with the decision of how to go about my normal life, or what would be normal in this new changed environment. It wasn't really possible for me to continue to do my job as I had done it before. So I really think that crises are also opportunities, and I had been thinking about doing something like walks around the city for a while, and we can talk about why. But what I realized was that it would be both possible to organize something like this during COVID, and also that it was a useful thing to do for people, because there was a sense that everything had been thrown into, you know, disrepair and chaos, and that nothing really seemed grounded anymore. We didn't know what was going to happen from hour to hour. But that we could look out our windows and the city was there, that the city was in some way a rock and a constant. And that the stories that the city told, that the ways in which it was a kind of, you know, canvas of millions and millions of lives, was a distraction and also a reminder of resilience, because the city has been through so much too. So, you know, I don't mean to overload what started as a, as a smaller project. I thought I would go to first look around Broadway with David Rockwell, the architect and designer, because all those theaters had just shuttered. And then I would look at Museum Mile because the museums had closed. And then I would see what happened. But I realized that it touched a chord for people, and for me personally, for me too, it became a kind of something to hold on to, and something that even when I was cloistered in this apartment and fearful of even going outside, it was something that gave structure and order, as the city does for us, all of us, you know, to my life. It was a connection with other people.
Yeah, and I feel like that, you know, for me, reading many of these parts of the book, and I want to talk to you a little bit more about the putting together of it because it's so interesting to me. But I think that for many people, especially those of us who stayed in the city, and I'm not passing judgment on people who left because I just didn't have any place to go. But I think that for
Me
people
neither.
who, yeah, so for people who stayed, especially for me, those articles were like, hey, I'm not alone. Because a lot of times walking on the street, you did feel a little bit, you know, it was both wonderful and terrible. But
Yeah.
I felt like, you know, when I was reading those, I thought, oh yeah, I'm going on this walk with Michael, who's so smart and such a great guy. And he's with these smart people who will bring these different, and it sounds like you're just immediately having these brilliant conversations as you're walking along the city. And as all of us in this business know, sometimes what appears very easy and fluid and
Right.
you know, spontaneous combustion takes a lot of work. And so
Right.
in your acknowledgements, I actually loved it. You say these casual walks resulted from days and sometimes weeks of preparation. So I wonder
Right.
if you could talk a little bit, just the process of how you decided where you were going to go, who you were going to go with, and then actually how did you do it? How much of it was really a walk and how much of it was it doing what we're doing, walking from
Right.
afar? And also, how much of what's in the book wasn't in the articles that were in the Times?
Sure. Well, okay. So, you know, as I said, I started with a couple of them as a, you know, testing the waters and also seeing if you know, the thing about the Broadway and the museums was that I felt they were ways of seeing the city at a moment that was very special, alarming, but also special, as we all felt walking around, because in the absence of the theaters and museums, you suddenly looked and saw the buildings and everything around them in a different light. But so in the case of the first one with David, it was, you know, I knew David Rockwell, and he just seemed a natural person to talk to. He had designed 1 million shows. He's won Tonys. He, you know, he's in the theater world, but he's an architect as well. So he could talk about, and I knew that he cared a great deal about the neighborhood and the architectural history of the area. And likewise, along Museum Mile, I was going with Andrew Dolkart, who is a great historian of the city, of architectural historian of the city. So that was natural. But once I realized that the project was catching on a little bit and people liked it, I began to think of it a little differently and began to think of essentially a project that would speak to the way in which the city is really put together by all of us actually, but by many different forces. It's not just architects who decide to build a building and that's just it. That not only do we each contribute, but that specifically to the sort of physical fabric of the city, that happens because of lawyers and politicians, community activists, engineers, a lot of different people who play different roles. And I thought, if I'm going to represent how the city exists and how you know, how it came to be, then I need to have that range of people. But I also then wanted to have a diversity of people in every sense of that word, and to have people who would speak to specific neighborhoods because it meant something to them. So the brief that I gave to everybody was, you know, tell me where you want to walk, what's meaningful to you, so that the walks would on some level be self-portraits, you know, either intentionally or by accident. And I think a lot of what comes across in chapters like the one about Jackson Heights with Suketu and Lucy Sant's chapter on the Lower East Side and so forth is really a memoir of their own childhood, their own, you know, past through the city, which of course is the way we experience the city as well. In other words, I didn't just want an architectural history or, you know, some sort of dry the description of what happens when you walk down the street. So there were these Venn diagrams of different overlapping desires, as you well know, that went into sort of calculating who and why and what and where. Some of it was instinct, some of it was the people. You asked a question, I'm giving you a long answer, but I'll just say, as the form developed for me and I understood what was required, it became easier for me to prepare with people, and by preparation I mean I would tell them what I was expecting. We would map out a route more or less. I didn't want to dictate what was happening too much, but I was always mindful of how that fit into the larger picture of things. And then, yeah, Julie, there's this thing that happens when you edit. And so you want to make a conversation that did come from many prior conversations and then itself took hours, work in a form that seems effortless and straightforward. But I don't think that they're lies. I mean,
No, I wasn't.
I
wasn't suggesting that.
No. But the way this is, it's always an interesting journalistic task that you want to represent someone's voice and you want to make sure that things are true in the deepest sense, even if not every single word that they spoke and I spoke during those hours is represented in the final version.
Right. And I think as you're talking about how you approach this project, it kind of leads to my next question, which is when you became the architecture critic in 2011, not everybody was happy about it. You didn't come from an architecture background. You were an art critic, very good one, I think.
Thank you.
You proved them all wrong. You became a Pulitzer Prize finalist a couple times for your work, so you had the last laugh. But
well, yeah.
How have you, well, not the last laugh, that'll be when you win it, but how have you approached the role of architecture critic? And how is it different? You sort of hinted at it already.
Yeah.
But how is it different from how it was done by your predecessors?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. Look, in my defense, I'll say that, I'd studied architectural history. I had edited a magazine called Industrial Design years ago. And so I wasn't sort of suddenly becoming a food writer who had done nothing but eaten occasionally. But you're right that there was, I think, a concern in some quarters that I would just treat buildings as art objects and that I would, it wasn't just that I wasn't a practicing architect, it was that I would somehow perpetuate an idea that architecture was just about celebrity and these incredible designs and so forth. The thing was, I took the job to do, in a sense, exactly the reverse, which was why the early concerns about what I was going to do were not just misplaced, but replaced by other concerns that I wasn't doing nearly enough of that sort of aesthetic appreciation of architecture and its formal and material inventions, because my interest, it really predates my interest in art too, was really in cultural history, social history, how culture works in the world, how the culture we produce makes the world, and specifically in this case, what is the world we're building? What kind of neighborhoods and communities are we building? A building doesn't exist as an abstract sculpture on a pedestal. It's on a street or somewhere in a community, in a neighborhood, maybe in a city, in a state. And that context is really, to me, the interest, that these buildings are lived and those lives are as important as what these things look like. And that my job as a critic is to really discuss how we build better communities and societies and to what extent what we are building contributes or not to that. So that was, I think, the shift, that there had been a lot of attention to architecture as a kind of formal, by formal, I mean material, visual, aesthetic practice. And I think that what I did was move it increasingly into a question of experience, to some extent politics, to some extent, just sort of a lived experience. And yes, that did affect the book. If I could just add, I think the important thing for me was to say that it's not just that a lot of people contribute to this, but that the city is a lived space, and it is a living organism. It changes as we do. We change it. And we saw under COVID the way the city could change, both for the better and the worse. And that is important, that we feel that the city is part of us and we have a role to play in the city. So I would say that that's been my desire as an architecture critic, to sort of look for these ways of discussing what kind of a world we're building, and more specifically to try to suggest, what a better community and city might be like, what not just look like, but how it would work. I don't know if I'm doing that, but that's certainly been my intention.
I think you definitely are doing that. And again, that's one of the things that I love so much about the book. And another thing I loved about The Intimate City, and this is a selfish reason, is I loved your description of what it meant to be a true New Yorker. So I grew up in Appalachia, strangely, and my children are born and bred here. And at some level, they don't think I or my husband, who's from St. Louis, are true New Yorkers. Yeah. And you have said they're wrong, because you argue that anyone can be a true New Yorker no matter where you're from. And so what I'd love for you to discuss is, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And when did you realize that? Because you yourself are born and bred, and how that belief builds on what you've talked about your work, the influx of all of us.
Yeah, look, my wife is not from New York, and we have a similar conversation with my children who were born and raised here about her. But the truth is that I do believe that New York is a place where you can show up and just decide the next day to call yourself a New Yorker, and that really is fine by me. And I think the reason that doesn't necessarily mean you are, fluent instantly in where the D train goes, or, or exactly where Tribeca ends and Soho begins. But it does mean that New York is a true cosmopolitan place. It's a place that is made up of the constant influx of different people and different cultures. And that's not a platitude. I lived in Berlin before I came back to be the architecture critic here. I lived in Europe, and I covered culture and political affairs throughout Europe and the Middle East. No matter how long I lived in Berlin, I was never going to become a German any more than I would become a cucumber or a glass of water, because that is a question of blood and heritage. That's not a thing about New York. And I think it's different even than just the question of America as an immigrant city. There is something special about New York, or I should say extreme about New York, in its cosmopolitan identity, this notion of being a place that thrives on and whose essence comes from the constant change and arrival of people and departure of people too. So I think that's crucial to celebrate and identify. It's a little bit of an undercurrent in the book too. There's a chapter about Chinatown, for example, which I really wanted to write about very early on, because there was all of that, racist attacks on Chinese Americans and a lot of xenophobia. And Chinatown suffered a great deal in the beginning because partly its physical fabric. I'm talking about the Chinatown in Manhattan. There are much larger ones, as some of people here know, in Sunset Park and Flushing. But the traditional Chinatown Manhattan is made up of these wonderful little alleyways and streets in what used to be called Five Points, a slum in Lower Manhattan. And we love that ordinarily, but that combined with all these other, and all these little shops, right? Combined with, COVID and all the other sort of plagues that were suddenly cast on that neighborhood, meant that people there were really suffering. And a lot of that neighborhood remains poor and working class and dependent on the income of those restaurants and shops and so forth. So I really wanted to write about that neighborhood, but I also think it was crucial to understand how central that story of Chinatown's growth and development was to the history of New York itself, a microcosm really of the way in which communities came here, found a home, grew, and became, a critical piece of the puzzle of New York's identity, and remain so even after all these years of change and dispersion throughout the city.
Thank you for that response. And so we got a question in the chat about something I want to talk to you about in a little bit, about your musical prodigy and music in your life. Sure. But before we talk about that, I do want to talk about your growing up in New York, and in particular, I love the inclusive quality of your worldview in architecture, and I would say with art as well, if memory serves me well. And you've talked in various interviews about how your worldview was shaped by your parents. So I wish you could tell me a little bit about that, about them, about your upbringing, and include the Jewish part apart from your rabbinic look right now, since we are at the American Jewish Historical Society.
Yeah, I grew up in Greenwich Village. And to answer a question I didn't answer before, the book includes various chapters, including one about the village, which I had not published in the Times. There's another in Mott Haven and another in Forest Hills and Queens. But in any case, I grew up in the village, and my dad actually had been born and raised in Philadelphia, but had moved to New York after the war. He was a physician, a surgeon, and a very, very politically active person who had come from a politically active family. His father had been a physician as well, and also a socialist in Philadelphia. My father was as far left as you can go. I don't know what else to say, just way out there. So our household was, and my mother, not to shortchange my mom was a native New Yorker, and her mother was, I think, arrived in New York from Austria, but a long time ago. So my mother was a native New Yorker. She was a sculptor. She'd been a physical therapist, and she was a wonderful sculptor. So my household was, I realized only later that it sort of came straight out of some, ridiculous, funny movies about crazy lefties. But it really was, I would come home and there would be a group of people in the living, there was Angela Davis and Leonard Boudin and, Allende and Gus Hall, the head of the Communist Party. And this was a constant sort of revolving door of people on the left. It was important to, in a lot of ways. I didn't come to share my father's politics exactly. And in fact, in a certain way, I think I ended up becoming a journalist because my father was a romantic. He was, I have to stress for those of you who are watching it who may not be sympathetic with the communist cause, my father was just a beloved and wonderful man. And he, in practical terms, he was involved in the civil rights movement. He was with the Freedom Riders in Mississippi. He was a founder of the Physicians for Social Responsibility, which was an anti-nuclear movement, and a lot of other things. He wasn't just sort of a late supporter of Khrushchev. But he did have this very romantic idea about the world. He was quite rosy in his picture, not of America, but of the potential of society. And that distorted his vision, for instance, of the Soviet Union until the last years of his life. So I think I became a journalist partly because I felt that the only way to understand the world was to atomize it, to look at it much more closely, to see how it actually existed in grays, not in black and white. But I also I realized in retrospect that there was a sense of sort of social responsibility and engagement. He used to read the New York Times. I've said this before, but it was a strong memory. He used to read the New York Times and circle it and cut things out because he was absolutely sure that it was run by the CIA, and that if he could just decode it, he would know what was going on there and, in Washington. But our house was full of sort of lefty journals and books, and the Times was important. And so I think it instilled in me a sense that writing was a useful thing to do, that it was a responsible thing to do, to engage with the public, to engage in a public conversation. And when I came to work for the Times, he was old then and not too well, and he didn't have all his marbles, but I will say he managed to say to me that he thought the New York Times had improved since I had gotten there. So I take that as a good thing. Yeah, so I mean, and the Village was a very different place than it is now, as well. So it wasn't just my family; it was the context of a society that was largely middle, but also partly working class, and a group of people who, in some ways, were very narrow-minded in retrospect, but also were willing to sort of think outside the box, and so I suppose in some way, although what I do is work for a very elite and middle of the road organization, I tried on some level to make this job as much a place to have a conversation around issues of culture and society, and not so much me just sort of declaring that I like this or don't like that, because in that aspect of being a critic, as you well know, Julie, is sort of the least interesting and useful.
This is such a wonderful insight into your work, actually, and so much appreciated. And so I guess you started playing the piano as a child. So I did say we were going to talk about that. And it's interesting because I wanted to, you wrote about this a number of years ago in a fascinating article about the experience of being a child prodigy, of walking away from that, and not just walking away, but for a long time.
Yeah. And
then returning years later. So, I mean, I know that's a subject of a whole conversation, but maybe you can give the dinner party version of it, and then follow up with a question from one of our audience members who said that it seems like many of our great architects have deep musical skills. David Libeskind, Raphael Vignoli, and he wanted to know if you could talk about that relationship between music and architecture, and whether you happen to favor the work of musical architects.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do think there is one gets into very squishy territory, right, when you start comparing these different forms, and music, I think, in a sense, because it's the most abstract, perhaps, of all forms, sort of artistic forms, is often used as the kind of natural analogy for what is essentially a kind of ethereal architecture of form. It doesn't surprise me that there are architects who are also musicians. I wouldn't say there's something inherently musical about architecture, because you could say that about certain kinds of writing, and you could say it about certain kinds of visual art and poetry and so forth. And I will not say that my favorite architects are all musicians, even if I like some of the people who are musicians. I like their work, but it's also not surprising. There is something about music and the sense in which you understand, in order to express yourself musically, you have to understand something about the architecture of the piece you're playing, the way in which it's fundamentally put together, and phrases are shaped, and some of the language is quite similar to overlaps too. I will say, yes, I did stop playing for a while. I came to, like a lot of young people, to a crossroad, and when I went to college, I sort of decided not to go to a conservatory and went to a college that had a conservatory, with the thinking that I would continue to dither about a decision. But I started to drift away for a variety of reasons. I just was interested in other things in the world. And then it became almost a point of pride when I started to work, and then I went to graduate school and started to study something else, that I had this sort of secret life as a musician, but I wasn't, but nobody saw me that way. It's hard to really say why that was interesting to me, but I liked almost having this sense of a past. I'll just say, after college, I had been encouraged I got a job working for this architecture and design magazine right out of school before I went to graduate school. But my childhood piano teacher insisted I not give up and just enter a competition. So I entered a competition here in the city, prepared for it, and almost won. Had I won, I would have had to give a performance at Alice Tully Hall. It would have steered me down that path. But doing well and allowed me to put it aside. And as I said, for reasons I still haven't quite analyzed, I liked putting it aside for a bit. When I got to the Times, that same childhood piano teacher sort of invited me to come back and renew our relationship. I'd known him since I was 5. And then after a while, he said I should invite some friends over to his studio and play for them. And I invited some people, including friends of mine who worked at the Times, some of whom wrote about music, because they were my friends, that's all. And I remember the expression on their faces. It was like you were in a dentist chair, and the dentist had a drill in your mouth and was asking you whether you would come to his performance of the Fantastics. He was in an amateur theatrical. People felt trapped, and obviously had to say yes, because they had no idea that I had ever touched a piano. And the reason I'm telling you that part of the story was I had renewed this friendship, which was very important. And now I had these people come over to my teacher's studio. It was a beautiful, chilly autumn Sunday afternoon. And let's just say the bar was so low in terms of their expectations that I managed to exceed it. And I remember how moving that experience was. Instantly, I understood there was something just incredibly beautiful about making something and sharing it with somebody, with people you knew and loved, people who might professionally go listen to music and didn't really have a lot of experience being in a room with someone 10 feet away making music for them. That the sort of the fundamental and traditional aspect of music making has sort of been so professionalized and distanced that there was a kind of intensity to this, both I think for them, but certainly for me. So that got me back to playing, and I have to say it's been very important, humbling. It's also been good for me to go out and give concerts again, because I think a critic should also be vulnerable and know what it's like to be in public and have to, bear that weight. And because I've gotten to play with very great musicians, and that's an experience I can't believe I put aside for a while. It's, you know, music is a deeply human thing, and I do think that it's affected my writing. I hope so.
And are you still performing?
Yeah, no, I gave some concerts right around Thanksgiving. I don't know how many of the people here are New Yorkers, but again, there's a wonderful spot in Brooklyn called Barge Music.
Oh, yeah.
Been around for many, many years, half a century or so. It's a wonderful place for recitalists and chamber music. And so I gave a few concerts there with a couple of three incredible musicians. And yeah, I do keep my hand in it. It's important for my mental sanity. And I'll just say, you can't see it here, but I'll move this to say, and there's my piano.
Oh,
So when I'm sitting at my desk, I'll get up and go to my piano, and also just moving even these few feet from one place to another is like moving from one universe to another. It's wonderfully cleansing and head clearing. And now I can't imagine not.
wow. Well, maybe we should talk to Melanie. We could do a concert at the Center for Jewish History has a beautiful auditorium, and maybe we could do a combination concert and discussion of architecture, which might be really fantastic. And I know I'm just throwing this out without discussing this with anybody.
Yeah,
But
listen,
I think it would be a fantastic evening.
I know you have a gig, Julie, but if you know, I'm looking for a music manager these days. So, I mean, you can, it wouldn't make any much money, either of us, but still. No, you're very sweet to think of it. Thanks.
Well, I think that would be really great. So I was Googling around about you, and I saw that before the pandemic, you signed a contract to write about the rebuilding of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And you had written an incredible piece about that when the horrible fire happened. What's happening with that? Sorry, I didn't mean to do that horrible thing.
No. It's just of course. So no, it's just that's what my editor is asking too. Yeah, it was interesting, of course, that on a entirely self-centered level, COVID derailed that project for me temporarily, because I had intended to follow the reconstruction of the cathedral and to sort of go back and forth, and you know, I couldn't leave the apartment. So in a sense, the walking book sort of took the place that Notre Dame was supposed to occupy. Now I will return to it, actually. But two things happened, I'll just say. So the walks became something that I focused on for a while, but I also this had started before COVID, but it came to fruition during COVID, which is that I started a nonprofit at the Times called Headway, which we don't probably have time to talk about here, but you know, hired a staff and started to produce things, and that was an entirely new enterprise for me. It's a project around big global issues and paths to progress, is the way we put it. So I wrote, for instance, about a giant piece on homelessness this past year, and those two things sort of made it impossible to turn back to Notre Dame. But I'm hoping to do it. I think it's my publisher asked me before, right after the fire, like literally right after the fire. The same publisher, Ann Godoff at Penguin, who's just the greatest. And it was clear that, you know, this was such a wonderful subject. I mean, there's no building in the world that still remains 800 years later, you know, still functioning, still such a central part of our life in that city and elsewhere. And that, I think, you know, its history is really an extraordinary history of architecture, not just when it was built, but also, its evolution, its reconstruction in the 19th century, and its changed meaning in the 20th and 21st. So I hope I get to that book. You're already making me feel guilty now, Julie. I should be.
Oh my God, I did not mean to make you feel guilty, although I
you
guess
know what
I'm
that's like. Deadline.
I do know what it's like, but I guess I'm just eager to read it, but I know you've been busy doing so many other wonderful things.
You're very sweet. Thank you.
And sadly, we're getting towards the end of the time today, and I did want to honor a really great question that came up in the chat, which was, and this may be like asking you who's your favorite child, but somebody wants to know what was the favorite walk that you took, and what was the most interesting, shocking, or some other superlative discovery you made while doing these walks.
Yeah, so you're right that it's like asking your favorite child, and I can't really do that. Also, all these people who contributed were extraordinarily generous and wonderful. So I don't want to pick one. However, I will say that I think in terms of the reactions to the ones that were published in the Times and even to the book, it is interesting that a couple of chapters that I mentioned, one, the Jackson Heights one, in which Suketu, Mehta, my friend, talks about his childhood there and the nature of that neighborhood. And then the one in the East Village with Lucy Sant as well. I think they have gotten a certain kind of reaction because they are so much about how the city, how we see ourselves in the city, how the city, we imprint ourselves and then read back these pentimenti of our own lives and our families in the city. And there's something melancholy and beautiful and also quite funny, I think, especially about Jackson Heights. But certainly the chapter that was, and I have to credit my wife Maria for this because she was sort of throwing out some ideas, and one of them was to talk about sort of the natural history of New York. And so I got in touch, that led me to think about a book by Eric Sanderson called Mannahatta. He's an ecologist, a scientist who's now based at the Bronx Zoo, but has done all this remarkable research on the ecological history of the city and published this great book called Mannahatta about what New York used to be like. So I as it were, I went with him to Lower Manhattan to pretend that we were there the moment Henry Hudson's ship sailed through into the harbor, and to sort of retrace the ecological history of the city, as I was doing with Suketu in his neighborhood or other people in the 19th century village and so forth. And that was mind-blowing. I mean, there were mind-blowing things throughout to get revelations from various people, seriously, throughout. For me, it was a super education. But there's no question that if you're standing in Lower Manhattan and someone says, at a certain point, we were under ice here, and that ice was the height of the Empire State Building, and that was before it melted, and a lake that was all the way up to Albany broke through and created the harbor by creating this open, there's a certain kind of, how can I put it, scale to those sort of discoveries that stuck with me. So those were a few. I honestly enjoyed all of them. I wouldn't have wanted to put one in there unless it was fun for people and a revelation for me too.
Well, I agree with you about Jackson Heights. I told you before the interview started that, inspired by your book, my husband and I took the 7 train to Jackson Heights, and honestly, there was an empty chair in the middle of that street, which is now a plaza, where the whole world is coming there. And I thought, I don't
Yeah.
have to go anywhere ever again. I just
Right.
have to come to Jackson Heights. Here is Michael's book. We did not get to answer all the questions I have. I think we're going to work on this piano architecture series, and maybe,
Sure.
and I hope if you have written about this, let me know. I did want to ask you just a personal New York question is, can we turn all those office buildings that seem to not be useful at the moment and maybe never again, thanks to Zoom, into affordable housing?
Yeah.
That is really.
I can try to answer it now if you want, or you can
I think
save
we
it
have
for
a
me.
couple minutes. Yeah.
This comes up, of course, and I think, especially now because we know what's going to happen. And so I'll say a couple quick things. Everyone here who's old enough will remember that after 9/11, everybody said, no one will ever live downtown. No one will ever build a skyscraper again. The city is done. And what followed immediately was the largest economic boom and the largest boom in the history of skyscraper construction, followed by an economic calamity in 2008, followed by another incredible, unprecedented boom, followed by COVID. So within the last 20 years, we've predicted the end of the world at least 3 times. I think, especially in an age of 24-hour endless, tweeting and news, we have become kind of amnesiac. So I'm not one of those people who's quite sure that those office buildings are doomed forever and that we have to repurpose everything, including the city. That said, one of the messages of the book is how organic the city is. I said it earlier, but the city is in a constant state of flux. It's a wonderful, evolving organism. And one of the great things about New York is that it has not been embalmed, in amber and stuck in amber, and it has allowed itself to change. And one of the threats to that is that we have come to see the city as so threatened by change that we are reluctant to allow things to change, which would make the city more equitable and keep it thriving. So, I will just end by saying I'm very optimistic about the city, and I think some of these changes we are now sort of talking about may take place, and some of them won't. But I'm not pessimistic that the city is dying, or that we are going to find a place that's only, welcoming to a tiny number of people. I think we've been through crises, and the great thing about the city is that it finds its way forward. I think we'll do it again.
Michael, that was the perfect ending. Now I know why I love you so much as a critic and person. Everybody buy this book. It'll make you feel happy, which is always a good thing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. It's a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And we will see you next month for the next installment of At Lunch.
Thank you.